My MP, Mark Jenkinson, is a bit of a smart-arse. He likes to do dog whistles. He likes to appeal to the lowest element in our society, the most bigoted, the most prejudicial, and the furthest right. One of his recent, I don't know the word really, one of his recent attempts to marginalise and victimise others in pursuit of the far-right bigoted vote is his attack on trans people. And he made a big deal about expounding the virtues of there being only two sexes, and if people are born biologically male or biologically female, then that's what they are. Well, I'd like to play a little clip for you now from the atheist experience. Not because it's about atheism, because actually it isn't. There are all sorts of questions come up on this show, and this one was about the biology of trans people. The co-presenter on this particular episode was a guy called Forrest Valkai, who, as well as being a science educator, is actually an evolutionary biologist in his own right. Here is what Forrest had to say. Eat your heart out, Jenky.
The phrase biological sex is sort of just this stand-in for genitalia a lot of the times. That's the way that it's used, because when you talk to people about trans folks, when you talk about biological sex with them, what they often talk about is either genitalia or their chromosomes, specifically their sex chromosomes, aka their allosomes. If you're into that kind of language, it's fun. Whether you're XX or XY and so on and so on. The fact of the matter, however, is that number one, that's not actually how we define sex in biology. And number two, the way that we do define sex in biology doesn't work all of the time. Just like every single definition in biology, there's a whole bunch of holes, there's a whole bunch of caveats, there's a whole bunch of if and except and unless and until and all these different things. There are very, very few definitions in biology that are very cut and dry, and sex is absolutely no exception to that. So when we talk about what Jim was just saying about intersex people, having both sets of genitalia is just one example of that. There isn't just XX and XY. You could be XXY. That's called Klinefelter syndrome. That's 3 sex chromosomes. You could be X and nothing else. You could be XY and still have a female body. When we talk about, what these chromosomes are, remember, chromosomes are made of genes. And so you could have damage or changes to one or more of the genes on those chromosomes and have a completely different presentation no matter what your chromosomes say. Also, all those genes are doing is coding for proteins and hormones and things, and those have to bind to receptors on your cells in order to make your body do anything, and those cell receptors are controlled by totally different genes. So the language of genetics is in no way like simple or easy to decipher, anything like that. So one example that I gave recently, I made a YouTube video about this, and so this is just one that's off the top of my head, is, when you talk about genitalia, you talk about gonads, you, me, and everybody else on this call, everybody else listening to this, has the genes for both ovaries and testes. And there's a complicated genetic dance between your sex chromosomes to finally get you to where you are, wherever you are, whether you have one or the other or both or neither or half of one or half of the other. You can have an ovotesty, which is an organ that has tissue from literally both. It's craziness. And so you have all these different examples. And again, that's just talking about chromosomes, which has nothing to do with our definition of sex. The actual definition of sex in biology is the size of your sex cells, your gametes. If you have lots and lots of very small gametes, we call those sperm and we call you a boy. If you have very few big gametes, we call those eggs and we call you a girl. The point is that when you throw around terms like biological sex, what you're actually doing is you're playing into, I wouldn't use the term a dog whistle, but a really, really myopic and parochial way of looking at the world that doesn't fit with actual biology. So when you throw around things like, oh, well, you were born biologically a male or biologically this or that, and you're choosing to be something else, not only is that a gross oversimplification of how these people actually feel and what they're actually going through, but it's also a misrepresentation of actual biological science. All these different configurations of having different kinds of sex chromosomes all fit into what we call intersex. And the actual likelihood of that happening, the actual, percent cases, is about the same as the likelihood of having red hair. So as many redheads as there are in the world, that's about how many intersex people there are in the world. Just so you know, it's not as rare as you might think. And lots of people don't even find out until like well into their life when they, for some reason, have a DNA test and they're like, oh shit, it turns out I had this situation going on. Anyway, and so what you talked about there, when you talked about someone who is, born a male, but they just don't feel like it, they don't feel this way or the other. There's a reason for that. One great example of that is that you have, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of this because nobody wants to hear this shit, but there are structures in your brain that are dimorphic. So male brains look this way and female brains look that way. And it's not the dumb old, men are smarter or whatever. These are patches of neurons the size of a grain of rice that are either a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, whatever. And we find consistently that trans people have brains that match their gender identities, not their genitalia. So it's not just that they woke up today and said, I think I want to be a girl today. It's that they literally have a woman's brain trapped inside, this, what you would call a male body. So it's a lot more complex than that. So when you're talking about why not just be a man wearing a dress and get away, there are some people that's totally fine. They just prefer the way that they look in dresses, and that's radical. I don't wear a dress because it's really breezy and uncomfortable. That is the only reason that I don't. And so, like, if I had a different opinion, I would probably wear one, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about trans people. We are talking about women. This is not a man wearing a dress feeling like a woman. This is a woman who, may have had the body that she didn't want to have, but it's not just a man playing dress up. It's not a woman who feels this way or that way. So it's again, it's an oversimplification, but because I'm not going to get into a 3-hour lecture on all of this, but you don't want that either. But this is a woman who feels like a woman and is having to deal with the problems of having a man's body and being perceived as a man by, the people around her. As far as medicine, which was the last thing you brought up, and I'm so happy you said that at the last moment there, talking about, if you go to the hospital and you say, hey, I'm a woman and I'm here to do this, and then they, lift up her skirt and they're like, oh, well, you clearly don't have a uterus, so what are we supposed to do with you? This is why there's such a push for trans acceptance and trans visibility now. And this is why there's so many biologists that are trying to talk about this stuff, because the simple fact of the matter is, just like with our definition of sex, it doesn't function. And that's fine. In biology, that's fine. The same way our definition of species doesn't make any damn sense either. And that's fine in biology because we know how to work around it. But when you're talking about the general public, that can kind of get sticky because now there's legal issues and there's medical issues and there's, sometimes moral and cultural issues that come along with this. So the big push here is just to identify the fact that, number one, sex and gender are completely different things. Gender is a social construct, not a biological one. You can't reduce down gender norms to biological sex, nor can you predict gender norms from biological sex. So these are very different things. Not one of them is a binary. Neither sex nor gender are binary. And the way that we perceive these things in our culture simply don't work. You cannot boil down almost 8 billion human beings into 2 boxes. It just doesn't work out that way. And so we need to have a serious adult conversation about how we want to treat these people and how we want to move on forward, re-identifying the way that we categorize people, or if we want to even categorize people at all. And when we talk about groups like this that have been historically marginalized and ignored and disenfranchised, I think it's really important to remember the phrase, nothing about us without us. It's their choice how we should be talking about them, treating them, working with them. It's their choice to give us instructions on how they want to be talked to, the same way that you and I would expect to have a public civil discourse. And that's kind of the direction that we're trying to move this in now, is where do we go from here now that we realize things aren't nearly as simple as we once thought they were, because nothing in biology is basic biology. Where do we go from here?